Welcome to this remote control quick tip. In this quick tip we're going to talk about drifting with your multi-rotor. Now, one of the common things that happens, particularly for new pilots, is they get to the point where they can hover their quadcopter around, and they've seen these videos on YouTube and other places where these things appear to be locked in place and their experience isn't the same. The model drifts around excessively and they're constantly having to put in correction in one direction to stop it from disappearing under its own steam. Now, all multi-rotors will have a tendency to be pushed around by the breeze and the wind a little bit, and unless you're using something like a GPS supported mode, then unfortunately they won't sit in the air absolutely still. They will gently drift around, but occasionally when you put a quad together, you'll find that when you've got it up in the air that you are having to compensate for a distinct pull in one direction or the other. Now, I've had a couple of questions about this. The latest one is from a gentleman called Hart Mose, and apologies if I've just absolutely butchered your name, but I thought, you know what, this is something that I haven't done a video on. It's probably worthwhile us covering it, particularly for new pilots. So here is the handful of things that I would normally check if I have built a quadcopter or a multi-rotor, taken it out for its test hover, and it has a tendency to pull one direction or the other. The first thing I would check is make sure the accelerometers are calibrated for level. Now, this is a step that isn't mandatory when you're setting up a lot of boards, and because of that, a lot of new pilots skip it because it looks kind of right in the screen. Now, when you connect your multi-rotor up to your computer and you're using a graphical user interface like Betaflight, CleanFlight, MultiWii, Conf, 8PM's, Mission Planner, any of those, there's usually a button to calibrate the accelerometers. And what you're actually doing in that step is you're teaching the quadcopter what level feels like. And that is the attitude that the board will always try and get back to. So if it isn't perfectly calibrated, then when the multi-rotor thinks it's level, it might be tilted slightly to one side or the other, maybe slightly forward, slightly back, and that causes your drift. So the first thing I do is pop your multi-rotor back into your computer, fire up the graphical user interface, put the multi-rotor on a completely flat surface, leave it alone, step back, and then click on the calibrate accelerometer button. The next thing to check is to make sure that all the middle channel positions settle at 1500. Now, having it at 1505, 1510 is actually read as the flight controller as you want to move in one direction. Because the way it works is a normal channel in a remote control vehicle goes from 1000 to 2000, with 1500 being the middle position, i.e. don't go in any direction. Now, using the sub trim on the radio, I would spend a bit of time making sure that all of the channels, particularly for roll, pitch and yaw, those are the three you're really interested in, make sure that they are all absolutely spot on with 1500. There'll be a sub trim menu on the radio, and make sure that in that sub trim menu, while you've got your machine connected up to the screen, just adjust the sub trim so it stops as close as possible to 1500. You'll probably find it wanders around by 1 or 2 in each direction. That's just the accuracy of the potentiometers typically in the cheaper radios, but don't worry about that. So long as it's close enough, that will also help as well. Next thing to try is do remember to always put the machine down. Once you've plugged the battery in, you should just let it settle and initialize properly. If it's been moved too much and you don't give it that second to orientate itself and power on and kind of establish what's going on, then it can unfortunately sometimes power up and have a bit of a problem. One of my fellow flyers in particular falls for this. He tends to power on his multicopter and then immediately starts walking around with it, and is surprised when it takes off and it doesn't fly very well. Next one then is to make sure you haven't moved the trims on the radio. If you've already done all that and it's been working fine, and then suddenly you take off and it's veering to one side or the other, just land it and just double check that all the trims on the radio are in the center position. It's very easy to knock the trims as you're moving around and putting the radio and getting all the other switches in place. I've done it myself and really been confused until I've realized that one of my trims had a couple of clicks in one direction. Last thing I would check is do check for a problem motor, ESC or prop. Excessive vibration on a craft can cause the flight controller to do very weird things, and we have things like low pass filters, and some of the new features in stuff like Betaflight 3 are all around trying to get rid of that unwanted vibration that can cause problems. But if you have a model that's been behaving perfectly and then it starts to list one side and all of the other things appear fine, I definitely check whether or not the bearings are okay in the motor on the side that's dropping, the ESC is alright and the prop isn't damaged, and also make sure that all of the balancing that you've already done is all okay as well. Last thing to check, of course, is to make sure the centre of gravity is in the middle of the frame. Mounting the battery too far forwards, backwards or to either side will also cause a problem and potentially introduce drift too. So hopefully for new pilots, if you kind of check out those things, that should get rid of the majority of drift problems with your quadcopter. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching, please like, subscribe and happy flying.